August 15, 1945. The air above Tokyo hung thick with the weight of surrender. Emperor Hirohito's voice, never before heard by common citizens, crackled through radio speakers across the archipelago, speaking in formal court language that most could barely comprehend. Yet the message was unmistakable. The war was over. The divine mission had failed. The sons of Nippon would not die gloriously repelling invaders on sacred soil. Instead, they would watch as foreign boots pressed into their homeland for the first time in 26 centuries. In the fishing village of Yokosuka, 43 kilometers south of the capital, an elderly woman named Kimiko Tanaka knelt on the tatami mat of her wooden home. Her hands trembled as she held a photograph of her son, last seen boarding a transport ship bound for Saipan in June of 1944. No word had come since. Through the paper walls, she could hear neighbors weeping. Others sat in stunned silence. The late summer cicadas sang their relentless song, indifferent to the collapse of an empire. Within days, the first American forces would arrive, not as the demon's propaganda had promised, but as occupiers nonetheless. For 8 years, the Japanese people had been told that the Americans were barbarous devils who would ravage their women, slaughter their children, and desecrate their temples. They were told that surrender meant extinction, that the white invaders understood only violence and domination. Schoolchildren had been drilled with bamboo spears. Housewives had been instructed in the use of sharpened garden tools. The final battle would be fought house by house, life by life, until the last Japanese citizen fell defending the Yamato spirit. But that battle never came. Instead came something far more disorienting than conquest, occupation with full bellies. The American military machine that rolled into Japan in late August and early September of 1945 arrived not merely as a fighting force, but as a logistical empire of staggering abundance. Behind the tanks and rifles came something the Japanese population, starved, exhausted, and traumatized, had never seen at such scale. Field kitchens capable of feeding thousands upon thousands of men 3 full meals a day, every day, without pause. Canvas tents the size of houses. Trucks loaded with crates of meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, sugar, and butter. Refrigeration units humming with electrical power. And the smell, God, the smell, of roasting beef, frying bacon, and fresh-baked rolls wafting across bombed-out neighborhoods where families had been boiling tree bark and grinding sweet potato vines just to survive. This was not the face of conquest the Japanese had been prepared for. This was something more unsettling, proof that the enemy they had been taught to despise lived in a world of such material wealth that they could wage total war on the far side of the planet and still eat like emperors. The Japanese home front had been starving long before Hiroshima and Nagasaki turned to ash. By 1944, the average caloric intake in major cities had fallen below 2,000 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic bodily functions. Rice rations dwindled to a few cups per week. Fish, once plentiful, disappeared from markets as the fishing fleet was commandeered for military transport and then systematically destroyed by American submarines. Soybeans became a luxury. Vegetables rotted in fields for lack of transport and labor. Sugar vanished entirely from civilian life. The government issued substitutes that mocked the very concept of food. Acorn flour. Sawdust mixed into bread. Dried silkworm pupae ground into a protein paste. Seaweed boiled until it became a gelatinous mush, served alongside watery miso soup made from fermented scraps. In the cities, rats grew fat while children grew thin. Blackouts were not merely for protection from American bombers, they also hid the sight of emaciated citizens scavenging through garbage. Mothers watched their babies' bellies distend with malnutrition. Factory workers collapsed at their stations from hunger-induced exhaustion. The elderly simply stopped eating, quietly willing themselves to die so their rations could go to younger mouths. This was the sacrifice demanded by the militarists who promised divine victory. This was the price of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And yet, propaganda sustained the illusion. Newsreels showed smiling soldiers dining on rice and pickled vegetables at the front. Radio broadcasts assured the population that American forces were in disarray, their supply lines broken, their troops demoralized. The Americans, they were told, were soft, weak, dependent on machines because their spirits lacked the steel of Yamato Damashii, the soul of Japan. When the final battle came, the superiority of Japanese spirit would overcome American material excess. Then the Americans arrived, and the people saw what excess truly meant. The 11th Airborne Division was among the first American units to enter the Tokyo area at the end of August 1945. They established camp near Atsugi Airfield, where General Douglas MacArthur would soon land to formally accept Japan's surrender. With them came the standard U.S. Army field kitchen apparatus, a mobile system refined over 4 years of global warfare into a machine of ruthless efficiency. Each field kitchen unit could feed 800 men per meal cycle. The setup was modular. Large canvas tents erected over portable cooking equipment, powered by gasoline burners that could boil 50 gallons of water in under 15 minutes. Refrigerated trucks kept meat fresh. Supply chains stretched back through Okinawa, Guam, the Philippines, and across the Pacific to California, moving millions of tons of food in an unbroken flow. The cooks, often specialists trained at stateside facilities, worked in shifts, preparing breakfast, lunch, and dinner with the precision of factory workers. The standard U.S. Army meal in 1945 was an embarrassment of riches by Japanese standards. Breakfast might include scrambled powdered eggs, bacon or sausage, pancakes with syrup, toast with butter and jam, coffee with sugar and cream, and fresh fruit when available. Lunch: roast beef sandwiches, canned vegetables, cookies, and lemonade. Dinner: fried chicken or pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread rolls, pie or cake for dessert, and more coffee. On Sundays and holidays, special meals were prepared: turkey with all the trimmings, steaks grilled to order, ice cream churned on site. This was not special treatment. This was the baseline. This was what every private, every corporal, every mechanic and clerk in the U.S. military expected as a matter of course. To them, it was simply chow. To the Japanese civilians watching from a distance, hungry, frightened, and disbelieving, it was a revelation that shook the foundations of everything they had been taught. Takashi Yamamoto was 17 years old when he first approached an American field kitchen in early September 1945. His father had been killed in the firebombing of Tokyo in March. His mother and 2 younger sisters survived in a makeshift shelter built from corrugated metal and charred wood. They ate once a day, a thin gruel of millet and water, and prayed for rain to fill their drinking buckets. Takashi had heard rumors in the neighborhood. The Americans were giving away food. Not selling it. Not trading it. Giving it. To Japanese. To the enemy. He didn't believe it. No army fed the people it conquered. No victor shared rations with the defeated. It was a trick, surely. A way to poison them or identify resistors. But hunger erodes disbelief. He walked 3 kilometers from his shelter to the American camp, joining a growing crowd of civilians who gathered at the perimeter each day. They stood at a distance, silent and wary, watching the foreign soldiers move about their enormous tents. The smell reached them first, a rich, fatty aroma that made Takashi's stomach clench with involuntary longing. Meat. Real meat, roasting over open flames. The scent was so powerful it seemed to carry weight, drifting through the air like a tangible thing. Some of the American soldiers noticed the crowd. They waved. A few called out in broken Japanese, trying to be friendly. The civilians did not wave back. They stood frozen, uncertain whether to run or stay. Then one soldier, a broad-shouldered man with red hair and freckles, walked over carrying a steel tray piled with food. He approached an elderly Japanese man at the front of the crowd and held out the tray. The old man stared at it, then at the soldier, then back at the tray. No one moved. The silence stretched. The soldier smiled and nodded, gesturing for the man to take it. Still no movement. So the soldier set the tray on the ground, stepped back, and returned to the tent. The old man looked down at the tray. On it, 2 thick slices of roast beef, a mound of mashed potatoes glistening with butter, a roll with a pat of yellow butter melting on top, and a piece of apple pie. Steam rose from the meat. The old man's hands shook as he knelt down, picked up the tray, and stared at it as if it might vanish. Then he began to eat. Not slowly. Not carefully. He ate with the desperate intensity of a man who had forgotten what satiation felt like. Within minutes, more trays appeared. Soldiers brought them out, set them down, and walked away. The civilians, first hesitant, then frantic, surged forward. Takashi found himself holding a tray, staring down at more food than his family had eaten in a week. He looked up at the soldier who handed it to him, a young man, maybe 20, with a tired smile and dirt under his fingernails. Their eyes met. The soldier said something in English. Takashi didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. "It's okay. Eat." Takashi ate. And as he did, something fractured inside him. Not his hunger, but his understanding of the world. This was not how conquerors behaved. This was not how enemies treated the defeated. This was something else. Something he had no framework to comprehend. The feeding of Japanese civilians by American forces was not official policy in the immediate aftermath of surrender. It was, in many cases, spontaneous, a response by individual soldiers and officers who saw starving children and skeletal adults and could not reconcile their abundance with such suffering. But as the occupation solidified, it became systematic. General MacArthur's headquarters recognized quickly that a starving population was a destabilizing force. Hunger bred desperation, and desperation bred unrest. If the occupation was to succeed, if Japan was to be rebuilt as a stable, democratic ally, the people needed to eat. And so, despite the fact that Japan was technically responsible for feeding its own population, the U.S. military began diverting supplies to civilian relief efforts. By October 1945, American field kitchens were serving thousands of Japanese civilians daily. Emergency rations, canned goods, powdered milk, flour, sugar, were distributed through local governments. Soup kitchens appeared in Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and other major cities, staffed by American soldiers and Japanese volunteers. Children lined up with bowls and cups, receiving hot meals that many had not tasted in years. The logistical scale was staggering. The United States was feeding not only its own occupation forces but also millions of former enemies. Supply ships arrived weekly at Japanese ports, unloading tons of wheat, corn, rice, canned meat, dried beans, and powdered eggs. The same supply chain that had sustained the invasion of Normandy and the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific now sustained the reconstruction of Japan. And the Japanese people noticed. They noticed that American soldiers ate 3 times a day and often left food uneaten. They noticed that the field kitchens discarded scraps that would have been treasured meals. They noticed that the Americans had so much, that they could afford to share with the very people who had tried to kill them. This was not mercy. Or rather, it was not only mercy. It was a demonstration of power more potent than any bombing raid. It was proof that the American system, the democracy, the industry, the individualism that Japanese propaganda had mocked as weak and decadent, had produced a society so wealthy, so efficient, so abundant that it could fight a 2-front global war and still have enough left over to feed its enemies. For the older generation of Japanese civilians, the cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. They had been raised in the Meiji and Taisho eras, taught that Japan's destiny was to lead Asia, that the Western powers were morally corrupt and materially inferior. The military propaganda of the 1930s and 40s reinforced this narrative. America was a mongrel nation, they were told, racially impure, spiritually hollow, obsessed with comfort and profit. The Japanese warrior, by contrast, was pure in spirit, disciplined, willing to sacrifice everything for the emperor and the nation. Yet here were those same spiritually hollow Americans, feeding Japanese children with their own rations. Here were those materialistic barbarians, setting up medical clinics to treat Japanese civilians for free. Here were those racially impure soldiers, playing with Japanese orphans and handing out chocolate bars. The propaganda had prepared the Japanese people for atrocities. It had not prepared them for kindness. Haruko Sato was a schoolteacher in Yokohama. She had taught her students that Americans were demons who would defile the sacred land of Japan. When the occupation forces arrived, she hid in her home for 3 days, expecting the worst. When she finally emerged, she saw American soldiers distributing food to a crowd of hungry civilians. She saw a young GI kneeling beside a crying child, offering a candy bar and a gentle smile. She saw laughter, actual laughter, between a Japanese woman and an American medic who was bandaging her injured hand. She stood on the street corner and wept, not from relief, but from shame. Shame that she had believed the lies. Shame that she had taught those lies to children. Shame that the people she had been told were monsters were, in fact, more humane than her own government had been. This was the quiet devastation that American field kitchens inflicted on the Japanese psyche. Not through violence, but through generosity. Not through domination, but through abundance. It forced an entire population to confront the possibility that everything they had been told about the enemy, and about themselves, was wrong. The symbolism of food in the American occupation cannot be overstated. In Japanese culture, food had always been deeply tied to identity and social order. The sharing of a meal was an act of trust and respect. The withholding of food was a form of control and punishment. The Japanese military had weaponized hunger during the war, starving occupied populations in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia as a method of subjugation. But here were the Americans, doing the opposite. They fed the defeated. They fed the enemy. They fed without condition, without expectation of loyalty or gratitude. And in doing so, they demonstrated a principle that was fundamentally alien to the militaristic ideology that had governed Japan for 15 years, the idea that human dignity transcended national identity, that abundance was not a zero-sum game, that strength could coexist with compassion. The field kitchens became a symbol of American democracy in a way no speech or proclamation could match. They were proof that a society built on individual liberty and economic freedom could produce not just weapons of war, but also mechanisms of care. They showed that the American system, chaotic, diverse, often messy, was capable of organizing resources on a scale that the rigid, hierarchical Japanese state had never achieved. And the Japanese people, especially the young, took notice. Takashi Yamamoto returned to the American camp again and again over the following weeks. Each time he was given food. Each time he watched the soldiers joke with each other, share cigarettes, play baseball in the dirt. They seemed so relaxed, so unburdened by the formality and hierarchy that defined Japanese military culture. They called their officers by first names. They complained openly about their duties. They laughed at their own mistakes. This, too, was disorienting. Takashi had been taught that discipline required rigid obedience, that strength required silence and submission. Yet these Americans, undisciplined by Japanese standards, had won the war. These Americans, who seemed to lack the warrior spirit, had crushed the Imperial Army and Navy.
How?
The answer, he began to realize, was in the food. Not the food itself, but what the food represented. The field kitchens were not just about feeding soldiers. They were the product of a vast industrial and agricultural system that valued efficiency, innovation, and abundance. They were the result of a society where farmers and factory workers and truck drivers all played a role in sustaining the military, not because they were forced to, but because they were compensated and respected for their labor. The American soldier ate well because American society produced well. And American society produced well because it was built on principles that rewarded effort, protected rights, and distributed prosperity more broadly than any system Japan had known. This lesson was not taught in speeches or classrooms. It was taught in the smell of roasting meat, the sight of fresh bread, the taste of butter and sugar and coffee. It was taught in the quiet generosity of a soldier handing a tray to a starving stranger. By the winter of 1945, the American occupation had settled into a rhythm. The field kitchens continued to operate, feeding both occupation forces and a growing number of Japanese civilians who relied on American aid to survive. The sight of long lines outside mess tents became commonplace. Japanese workers were hired to assist with food preparation and distribution, earning wages that allowed them to buy additional rations on the emerging black market. But the deeper transformation was psychological. The Japanese people, especially the young, began to internalize the lesson of abundance. They saw that the Americans did not hoard their wealth but shared it. They saw that American soldiers treated Japanese workers with respect, paying them fairly and thanking them for their labor. They saw that the American system, for all its flaws, produced results. This realization did not come easily or uniformly. Many older Japanese clung to the old ways, resentful of the occupation and mourning the lost empire. Nationalist groups formed in secret, plotting futile resistance. But among the youth, the generation that would rebuild Japan, there was a growing sense that the future lay not in the past, but in the model the Americans represented. Takashi Yamamoto eventually found work with the U.S. Army as a translator. He ate in the American mess hall, sitting beside soldiers who taught him English slang and shared stories of their homes in places called Iowa and Texas and Georgia. He learned about baseball, jazz music, and the concept of individual rights. He learned that democracy was not weakness, but strength. Years later, after the occupation ended and Japan began its miraculous economic recovery, Takashi would tell his own children about the first time he ate American food. He would describe the roast beef and mashed potatoes, the roll with butter, the apple pie. And he would tell them that in that moment, he understood that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the fundamental difference between a society that starved its people for the sake of the state and a society that fed its people, even its enemies, because abundance was the foundation of its power. The field kitchens of the American occupation were not acts of charity. They were instruments of policy, tools of psychological warfare, and symbols of a worldview. They demonstrated, more effectively than any propaganda campaign, that the American way of life was built on a foundation of material prosperity that was not accidental but structural. They showed that democracy and abundance were not contradictions but complements, that a society which respected individual freedom could also achieve collective greatness. For the Japanese people, the experience of being fed by their conquerors was humbling and transformative. It forced them to reckon with the lies they had been told, the sacrifices they had endured, and the future they might build. It planted seeds of doubt in the militaristic ideology that had brought them to ruin, and seeds of hope in the democratic principles that would, in time, reshape their nation. The field kitchens are mostly forgotten now, a footnote in the grand narrative of post-war reconstruction. But for those who stood in line, hungry and uncertain, and received a tray of hot food from the hands of a foreign soldier, they were unforgettable. They were the moment when the war truly ended, not with the signing of a treaty, but with a quiet acknowledgment that the enemy was not a demon, but a human being offering bread. And in that offering, the seeds of a new Japan were sown, not in the ruins of empire, but in the humble act of breaking bread with the victor, and learning that abundance need not be a weapon, but a gift. In the decades that followed, Japan would rise from the ashes to become one of the world's great economic powers. The generation that had eaten American food as children would build factories, design cars, and engineer technologies that would rival and even surpass their former occupiers. They would create their own version of abundance, rooted in discipline and innovation, blending the best of Japanese tradition with the lessons learned from American pragmatism. But those who remembered the field kitchens never forgot the lesson of that first meal. They remembered that strength without compassion is tyranny, that abundance without generosity is emptiness, and that the true measure of a civilization is not in how it treats its allies, but in how it treats its enemies after the battle is won. The smell of roasting beef, the sight of fresh bread, the taste of butter melting on a warm roll, these were not just food. They were the flavor of a new world, a world where democracy and abundance walked hand in hand, where the defeated could become the prosperous, and where the future was not written in blood but in the simple, profound act of sharing a meal. This is the story that history books seldom tell. This is the quiet revolution that followed the thunder of war. This is what happened when Japanese civilians, starving and broken, encountered American field kitchens and discovered that the enemy they had been taught to hate was, in fact, the harbinger of a future they had never imagined possible. And in that discovery, an empire fell, and a democracy was born.